We can, yeah, we can say that. I mean, we go to, I think it's West.
Yeah, right, there's stuff out there, so that's.
And maybe it was so stronger before this.
I can only watch a little, there's so, I get tired of watching those.
I watch it too.
I know, that's not some good apps and things. First of all, you're all, you're 1,500 red.
Oh, no.
Really? Where?
Yeah, like,
Oh, yeah. Oh.
I like it. When there's one hill on the. On the other sheet.
Wow.
Oh, I know this is Tiger. I love
I could only. No one show.
Testing 1, 2, 3. Testing 1, 2, 3.
Hello, everybody. We're still setting up, so bear with us. We'll be starting in about 3 or 4 minutes.
Oh, let's see, can you, oh, it was on the outside.
It's a magic microphone.
Let me just go to the other side.
We're good to go? Hey, everybody. Welcome to tonight's program. Good evening. Hi, everyone. If I could have your attention, please.
Are you guys ready to start? Okay, thanks.
All right, awesome. Thank you, Pat. Good evening and welcome to our program. Thanks for joining us tonight on this dreary, cool evening, typical spring in Chicago. I'm Amara Razgis. I'm the president of the Norwood Park Historical Society, and I'm happy to be with you tonight. both here in person, and we are streaming live via both YouTube and Facebook. So we've got a pretty good audience. Before we get started tonight, let's go over just a few basic things. First things first, please silence your cell phone, vibrate, whatever works for you. Thank you very much. And we have some general announcements for the Norwood Park Historical Society. Just so you know, we are continuing to follow COVID-19 guidelines and restrictions. As of today, we are open for educational programs. Awesome. The museum opens on March 27th and reservations are required. So visit the website at www.norwoodparkhistoricalsociety.org for more information or to reserve your time slot. We're restricted on the number of people that we can host for events and for programs, but we are open for parties, for programs, all sorts of fundraisers, so we're excited to invite you in. The Historical Society is bringing back events and programs, so if you've got your calendar or your phone on you tonight, you might want to mark down a couple of dates. April 21st, Alderman Napolitano, the Alderman of the 41st Ward here, will be speaking, so please join us that evening. May 19th is our annual member meeting, which includes voting for the next slate of directors and officers. So please, if you're a member, join us in person or virtually. And a sampling of a couple of other events to jot down. July 24th is Norwood Park's birthday party. That's also here at the Noble Seymour Crippen House. August 14th is the yard sale. And Victoria's Craft Boutique, our holiday craft show. Members Night is Wednesday, November 10th. And the event opens to the public on Wednesday, November 11th through Sunday, November 14th. So we're looking ahead. We're hoping that we all stay safe and healthy. These event dates are tentative at the moment, but we'll be continuing to update our website and information on Facebook if you need information about events, times, all that good stuff. All right, are there any questions, basic information you need to know about before we get started with tonight's program?
There's no picture.
Okay, well, thank you. So there's no picture at the moment. All right. So to get us started, kind of interesting, early this morning, I got a text message from the City of Chicago's emergency notification system, and the Jackson Boulevard Bridge would be closed today for bridge testing. Normally, I ignore these. I'm not really concerned about what's going on with bridges that I don't cross every day. I'm not headed in that direction today, but today was a little different. I knew Patrick McBriarty would be here tonight, and he would be telling us the story about Chicago's bridges. So that got me thinking about how incredibly important these bridges are to the city of Chicago, whether you're walking on them, driving on them, or riding under them on a boat. So I won't steal any of your thunder, Pat. So let's get started. Thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Great, thanks for having me. I'll just take this off to speak briefly. And the film itself, I do the narration, and unknowingly when we first started this project, got thrown on camera multiple times before I realized, that was gonna happen so often. And my partner, Steve Hatch, I was hoping he could make it tonight, and he had another engagement. But the two of us co-produced and created this documentary, and I'll let it speak for itself, and then happy to answer or chat about it afterwards. And yes, the bridges, I should mention that are opening. They've been systematically just testing the bridges before the official bridge lifts that will start in the spring for boats to go out to the harbors. And the harbors open, I believe, on May 1st, or maybe April 15th. I'm not sure exactly this year when that is. So then they'll start to do some of those lifts. And so they just do the test every spring to most of the bridges to make sure there's anything that needs to be repaired and they're operating properly. So anyway, on to the film, Chicago Drawbridges.
This is Chicago, the largest metropolitan area in the Midwest, the third largest city in the United States, and 25th largest city on Earth. In less than 200 years, Chicago rose from a swampy French and Indian trading post into a world-class city. Chicago is all about location, location, location. With its prime real estate situated on the southwestern shore of Lake Michigan, it has become a diverse city, a patchwork quilt of neighborhoods, industry, businesses, and attractions. Today, Chicago is known for its elevated trains and downtown loop, Mercantile Exchange and Financial District, the blues, wonderful architecture, cold winters, great food, and sports teams. Knifing through it all is the Chicago River, parsing the busy city into its north, west, and south sides. It is the river that has essentially defined and created Chicago. Besides being the Windy City or Second City, Chicago is also the drawbridge capital of the world. No doubt Amsterdam, Pittsburgh, and Venice have more bridges, but no other city generated as much innovation, and as many different movable bridge designs as Chicago. My name is Patrick McBriarty, and I used to not care about the bridges. Until one day, a bridge got in my way. Up until about 10 years ago, I was pretty much like everybody else. I didn't think much or give any real consideration to the bridges here in Chicago. They were just there and one way to get from point A to point B. As a kid, we moved around a few times, but then really settled in Youngstown, Ohio. And Youngstown, while I was growing up, was a big steel town. I was visiting Chicago and met my wife through some friends sailing, and then got married in 1995. Very happily married for about 5 years, and then in November of 1999, she died suddenly, and that completely, blows your world apart, and you end up trying to figure out who you are, what do you want to do, and what drives you again. I picked up a camera. I'd done some photography in high school and had enjoyed that, so I ended up going to Kinzie Street and really kind of saw the bridges as there's more than these just simple structures. I mean, there's steel here, there's this gritty aesthetic that kind of drew me in, and now I can't look at a bridge the same way. When I was first researching the bridges, I found out Chicago was the drawbridge capital of the world, and that just really seemed to hook me, and from there the journey began. Soon after discovering Chicago was the drawbridge capital of the world, I found out that today's bridges are called Chicago-type bascules. These bridges were designed by City of Chicago engineers around the turn of the last century. The term bascule is a French word meaning seesaw, suggesting heaviness and balance. The centuries-old bascule principle was commonly used on castle drawbridges. Modern bascule bridges have leaves, each operating like a huge teeter-totter, rotating at a pivot point positioned off-center. Bascule bridges are comprised of a short and long arm. The long arm extends over the waterway, while the short arm is used to hold a counterweight. The counterweight changes the leaf's center of gravity, moving it to or very near the point of rotation. By balancing the bridge leaf, very little effort is then required to open or close even a many thousand-ton bridge. Led by city engineer John Erickson, these bridges were developed specifically for the Chicago River. Based on the Tower Bridge in London, the world's most recognized bascule bridge. The Chicago-type drawbridge is also internationally recognized and has been used all over the world. I had conflicting answers on where the first bridge in Chicago was. And once I dug into that, it revealed a very interesting story about Chicago's earliest beginnings. It was here in 1829 that Archibald Caldwell built the first ferry, and it was just a line strung across the North Branch with a canoe on either side. Locals referred to it as the Grapevine Ferry. He was running Wentworth's Tavern, which was here on Wolf Point, and competing for the business of the small village and military outpost. Opposite him was his competitor, Samuel Miller, who ran Miller's Tavern. Miller decided to one-up things and built a footbridge on the North Branch just back over here by the Kinzie Street Railroad Bridge that stands up in the air today. Like a lot of the early Chicago bridges, and this was the very first, here on the North Branch of the Chicago River, it was done in self-interest to generate business, and it influenced the local economy to grow the city of Chicago. Oh, thanks, Steve.
Sure.
Now, building a bridge to get to a tavern makes a lot of sense to me. It'd be a great improvement over trying to climb into a canoe and cross the river, particularly after a few drinks. So whether it's a hot, steamy Chicago day or in the dead of winter, a bridge connecting patrons to a tavern is a great business idea. So here's to Samuel Miller. He built the first in a long line of Chicago River bridges. To Samuel Miller. The amazing thing about doing that photography at Kinsey Street was then later finding out that here, 170 years before, is where the first bridge in Chicago was built. And I was there and had the seed planted in my mind of doing this research on Chicago's bridges.
While researching the history of Chicago River bridges, a man named David Salzman kept coming up. David is a well-known geographer and professor and author of a book on the Chicago River. Behind the story of these remarkable bridges is the story of a vital river.
Hello, I'm David Salzman. I spent quite a bit of time musing about the river and the bridges and all of the other things that go with the river. I remember being in China. I was on a river cruise to the mouth of the Yangtze. I met a fellow from Japan who was an engineer, and he asked me what I did, and I told him, and I said I'd written a book on the Chicago River, and he said, "Is it a big river?" I said, "No, it's very small, 30 some odd miles, depends how you measure it." He said, "Well, why are you so interested? Here's the Yangtze, you know, this great, long, huge river." And I had to say to him, as I would say to anyone, a lot depends upon where the river is. And this river was a key to understanding the origin and growth of the city here, and for that matter, this whole western expansion, because what happened in Chicago turned the rail network 90 degrees. It had traffic and commerce had gone up and down the Mississippi, north and south. But after Chicago got rolling and established a portage on this little river, suddenly the railroads came in and started traffic moving east and west. Chicago's origins date back really to the 17th century. 1673, Marquette and Joliet came through here on their return trip from their first exploration of the Great River, which was what they then called the Mississippi. This new route that they were led to follow came up the river that we now call Illinois, through the Des Plaines, and then a portage. And in times of wet weather, the portage that they followed was a very simple one. It led from the Des Plaines over a very short stretch of ground to a feature of the landscape that early settlers called Mud Lake, and that gave access to the south branch of the Chicago River, and from there to Lake Michigan. So that was the origin of interest in this specific place. Chicago's small river has two branches, one to the north, which then breaks up into three tributaries, and the south branch itself had a number of small tributaries, most of which are now gone from the landscape. The stream we know today is so utterly different from the stream that greeted the first outside settlers. There were no settlements at the mouth of the river, but the native peoples did settle near hunting grounds to the north especially. And when outside settlers came, they were interested in fur. One of our earliest settlers was hired by John Jacob Astor's American Fur Company, and he came and as a teenager and lived into his 80s. And when he arrived, there were just a couple of hundred people milling around in the area. When he died toward the end of the 19th century, there were over 1 million people here, an astonishing growth. But believe me, that growth is all here because the river was here. And it's interesting in a time of cyberspace, the net, and jet travel to think about just 150 years ago or so, how important the presence of a surface stream was to the original impetus and growth of this area.
bridges have been a long part of Chicago's history. Again, not just part of architecture and design, but certainly about commerce and development. The city of Chicago, of course, would not be the city it were it not for the Chicago River in general and the bridges in particular. Chicago's development started south of the river and then obviously moved north of the river as well, and the bridges help facilitate that.
This rapid growth on the flat prairie landscape in an age of sale and high value of land made drawbridges a good fit for Chicago. However, finding the perfect drawbridge design was a problem that would play out over the next 100 years. I wanted to find out where Chicago's first drawbridge was built and how it came into being. So that's when I came to the Research Center at the Chicago History Museum and found the next piece in the puzzle. In 1834, the city built its first drawbridge at Dearborn Street. It was similar to today's bascule bridges, but used two rectangular, or what were then called gallows frames, because of their common usage in hangings. Ropes with block and tackle were run from the end of each leaf and over the frames. By winding or unwinding the rope around wooden drums at each shore, the bridge could then be opened and closed. Much used, this drawbridge soon became temperamental and expensive to maintain. To the frustration of early residents, it was once stuck open for over 48 hours, and despite many attempts by its bridge tenders, no amount of effort would close it. Since the earliest beginnings, the bridges have been intertwined with politics. The best story is early on in 1839 when the Dearborn Street Bridge was then voted to be removed by the Common Council. And to prevent the Common Council from rescinding that order, citizens came out with shovels, pry bars, saws, and tore the bridge down. This was part of a larger conflict that was happening between the north and south sides of the city, where Southsiders wanted to capture all the wagon train that was coming up from the local farms and the region. So this commercial and political battle between North and South Siders led to an impasse in the Common Council that was finally broken then when William Ogden, who was the city's first mayor, and Walter Newberry, who was a North Side merchant, donated 2 city blocks to Catholic authorities. And those city blocks are where Holy Name Cathedral stands today. The deadlock was broken and the Common Council voted for the first Clark Street Bridge, which would be the city's 4th bridge and the 2nd drawbridge, and connected the north and south sides of the city.
One of the things that they try is building a pontoon, just a hollow wooden box, probably sealed with pitch or tar to make it watertight, and floating one end of the bridge on that and having the other end on shore with a pivot so that it can just kind of pull back from across the channel and allow the ship to go past. Pontoon bridges only last a decade or 15 years in Chicago, but they are still useful in a lot of places in the world where the water is too deep to actually put down piers. And so there are pontoon bridges, modern ones, that cross Lake Washington east of Seattle. So the city had built perhaps a dozen of these floating pontoon bridges. And then occurred one of those kind of remarkable disasters that we seem to have in Chicago. We never seem to have any simple disasters. In the spring of 1849, a rainy spring arrives along with the spring thaw, and a flood starts making its way downriver. Of course, back then, the Chicago River still flowed into Lake Michigan. And so big chunks of ice start getting carried downstream, and they can see the disaster coming. In fact, they can hear it coming because these big chunks of ice are breaking up, sounds like cannon shot in the distance, and the ice is pushing before it the water, which is pushing up the ice, and then this starts meeting the bridges. And carrying the bridges downstream in front of it, and so they can hear it coming. They can sail a few of the boats out into the lake to safety, but there's just not time to get the others. And so this entire bundle of ice and bridges and boats that are being carried before it sweeps through the downtown section and tears away all of the pontoon bridges, and you end up with just a mess of timber and sails and masts and rope, all sort of at the mouth of the Chicago River. So one of those wonderful kind of Chicago disasters that could happen nowhere else.
The Illinois and Michigan Canal opened in 1848. It allowed shipping from the Great Lakes through Chicago to the Mississippi River and the Gulf of Mexico. Soon followed by the development of the railroads, Chicago became a major transportation hub and the nation's transshipment and warehouse center. Chicago's population grew from 4,000 residents in 1830 to well over 90,000 by 1857. As the young city became a mecca for commerce, more substantial and reliable bridging solutions were needed to support the rapidly growing city. The pivot, or swing bridge, was the next movable design tried on the Chicago River. The weight of the bridge was concentrated on the center pivot. These bridges operated like a lazy Susan, as the bridge turntable contained the center pivot and a circle of friction rollers within. This bridge would prove to be the dominant movable bridge solution in Chicago and for the nation over the next 40 years. They required less maintenance than pontoon bridges and permitted passage of small boats underneath. The bridge tenders typically operated the pivot and swing bridges by placing an angular iron bar, or key, 4 to 6 feet long, into a fitting at the center of the bridge deck. By repeatedly walking the key around in a circle, the reducing gears and turntable rotated the bridge to open and close it. On a hot day, with the busy ship traffic, a bridge tender really earned his money, which in 1858 was $60 to $150 a month, depending on the bridge. For a time, appointed by the mayor, this became a political patronage job, and bridge tenders were bonded against negligence and granted police powers on the bridge and for the immediate vicinity.
So one of the most dramatic bridge disasters occurred in 1863. It was at the Rush Street Bridge in November on Election Day, when the main bridge tender was away for the Copperhead Party peddling tickets at the polls. He had gotten a substitute, and the substitute bridge tender, which accounts described as an ignorant Irishman, did fine most of the day until about 5 o'clock. There was a herd of cattle being driven across the bridge from the south side to the north side. There was also on board the bridge at that point a buggy and wagon, and there was a woman with 2 children on the bridge and a few other men. Well, a tug was coming and tooted for the bridges to open. People on board the bridge saw what was going to happen, yelled at the bridge tender not to open the bridge, but he proceeded anyway. He and his assistant started to turn the bridge, and as it turned, there was still about 60 cattle on the north end of the bridge. And as it rotated away from the abutment where it was resting, then it started to drop slowly as it rotated further into the river. And then suddenly, the south end of the bridge was elevated high up into the air. There was a loud reports of cracking of steel and wooden beams as the bridge just collapsed, a total ruin, throwing the cattle and the people and the wagons into the river to swim for their lives. The disaster was so great, the Copperhead mayor, Mayor Sherman, had a new contract for another Rush Street Bridge out within 2 weeks, and 4 months later, a completely new bridge was built and opened to traffic.
The robust swing bridge design offered greater stability and construction of longer, wider, and heavier spans. Better bridges were demanded to convey the ever greater traffic of the rapidly changing city as it doubled and tripled in size. And yet, another Chicago disaster was just around the corner.
So everybody knows about the Great Chicago Fire. And what I wanted to know was, how did that affect the bridges? Basically, a fire raged through Chicago. Most of the city center was burned up between October 8th and October 10th in 1871. The fire raged for over 3 days, with acres and acres of destruction and over 100,000 people left homeless. And at that time, too, Chicago was mostly made of wooden structures, while the bridges were also mostly wood, even while iron was becoming more and more available. The fire then destroyed 8 bridges right in the heart of downtown Chicago. Several heroic bridge tenders, most notably Ira Boyer and his son Charles, continued to work the Madison Street Bridge, helping the terror-stricken people across until the very hair on their heads was singed by the flames. Another, Martin Casey at Lake Street, held the bridge to get people across despite repeated orders to open the draw and save the bridge. Recruiting some 50 men, they broke into a nearby hardware store and secured pails, ropes, axes, and crowbars to drench the bridge with water, dig trenches, and tear up the wooden approach planks. Fighting the flames to maintain the crossing, they did not cease until every last soul was safely across. Money was set aside almost right away after the fire for the 8 bridges to be rebuilt, which were completed by 1872. And it was amazing to me how here you have a third of the city homeless, and yet because the bridges are so important, those were one of the top priorities for rebuilding the city. Rising from the ashes, Chicago rebuilt and became the busiest port in the world during the 1880s. At its peak in 1887, the Chicago River saw over 21,000 ship arrivals and departures, fueling Chicago's growing industry. The increasing availability of steel brought about larger ships. As a result, no other city in the world experimented with as many different movable, and in particular, bascule bridges as Chicago did between 1890 and 1910. Prompted by the city's continued development and need to improve national waterways, a new design was demanded to replace the swing bridges, particularly on the Chicago River. The new, bigger steel ships forced removal of the swing bridge center piers, which made navigating important sections of the Chicago River difficult or impossible. With no clear bridging solution, inventors, engineers, and entrepreneurs rushed to solve this emerging infrastructure problem. However, the shortcomings of private sector bridge attempts would eventually push City of Chicago engineers to create their own drawbridge design. Inventors and engineers saw an opportunity to design the next bridge to replace the swing bridge. The very first experiment the city tried was what was called the folding lift. And this was invented by William Harmon, and it was also called Harmon Jackknife Bridge. The design was a little too complicated, had too many moving parts, and the city looked for another solution. The next solution was a vertical lift bridge. This was a bridge designed by J.A.L. Waddell, a Kansas City engineer. And Chicago built the first of its kind in the world at South Halsted Street in 1894. It featured massive steel towers on each riverbank that were connected by the bridge roadway. The bridge worked basically like an elevator, so it was pretty straightforward, but it was somewhat expensive to build and was quickly surpassed by yet another design the city tried. Behind me is the Scherzer Rolling Lift Bridge at Cermak Road. Formerly called 22nd Street, this bridge was built by the Sanitary District in 1906. These bridges worked by rolling up and back, very much like a rocking chair. The only problem with this bridge was the fact that after a couple of years, these segmental steel girders would deteriorate because when they opened and closed, the shifting wind pressures would cause the bridge itself to wag. That wag would also cause the foundation of these bridges to walk towards the center of the river as much as an inch or two each year. Then when the two leaves would come together, they might overlap or bang up against each other and not allow the bridge to close completely. It was because of these faults in this design that then the city of Chicago eventually would go ahead and build its own Chicago-type bascule bridge and come up with the ultimate solution for the Chicago River. We're here in the Bridge House Museum with Jim Phillips. And Jim is a retired engineer and also volunteers on occasion here at the Bridge House Museum. Jim, tell us a little bit about the history and the Chicago bridges.
One of the things that I find interesting about the bridges in Chicago is that the concept of the bascule bridge is something that dates back to the Egyptians. The actual implementation of the concept that was actually worth something to civilization had to wait for the development of material science to come into being.
Right, because they didn't have the steel or that in Egyptian times.
Exactly. And so they could do it on a small scale, but when you needed to cross a larger body of water, then you had to do something else.
Right.
So the first bascule, or one of the most notable bascules, was built in St. Petersburg, Russia. And then up around in the 1890s, then the bridge that was actually used as the model for the Chicago bridges, the Tower of London Bridge, was built. There was a lot of pressure from the U.S. government for the engineers to replace the swing bridges in the river, because they were taking up too much real estate in the river. They needed some more space to handle the larger vessels. And so you had the engineers looking for some sort of a vertical way to open up the bridges. And so that was the perfect opening for the bascule.
Right.
And there seemed to be a little friction between Scherzer and John Erickson at the time, who was the city engineer. And so you've had all of these things kind of come together, and it turns out the bascule works because it has the simple machinery, it's a robust design, and there is no patent on it.
Ah, right, because it's so ancient.
Yeah.
We're here at Clybourne Place, later renamed Cortlandt Street. And this bridge is the very first Chicago-type bascule bridge. This is the first of a series of bridges of the Chicago type built between 1902 and 1911.
These first-generation bridges are identified by their signature high curve tail ends and 3 truss superstructures. A rack on the ends of the 3 trusses meshes with a pinion or drive gear just below the roadway. Engaging the rack, the tail end of the bridge is driven down to raise the bridge and open it.
They really operate on the same principle as does a teeter-totter. You have your horizontal surface that's balanced with a concrete weight on one end, and it pivots on an axle or a trunnion, similar to a teeter-totter. So even though the bridges look heavy and imposing, they're really delicately balanced. In fact, most of the bridges use motors of comparatively small horsepower. You'll find 100 to 110 horsepower motors that are moving hundreds of tons of metal and steel because they're so delicately balanced. I don't think a lot of people would refer to several hundred tons of steel and concrete as graceful, but I really think the bridges are graceful. Anyone who's seen them in operation really stops and pauses to look at all of that steel and concrete moving so slowly and so smoothly up, and then seeing the skyline in the background. It's really a sight that truly is unique to Chicago. The Michigan Avenue Bridge is arguably the city's most famous bridge known throughout the world. It celebrated its 90th birthday in 2010, and that bridge really operates as well as it did when it opened in May of 1920.
Granted landmark status in July of 1991, the Michigan Avenue Bridge is the pinnacle of innovation for the Chicago-type bascule bridge. These are the bridges that were designed by city engineers around the turn of the century to become the ultimate bridging solution for the Chicago waterways.
Friends of the Chicago River opens the Bridge House Museum every spring through fall. And everybody who walks in actually walks into this fantastic 5-story tower. We're on the ground floor right now, but you get to spiral up all the way to the top, where you get to see some fantastic views of Chicago and the river.
So you can actually get inside a bridge house here in Chicago.
You get inside a bridge house, and not only that, but you actually get to see the gears here. What's really fantastic is that on days when the bridge goes up, you can be 2 feet away from the gears and actually see how this entire mechanism works.
Before the Michigan Avenue Bridge, Chicago's main shopping and commercial district was on State Street, that great street, as the song says. But after this bridge, it began to shift, and by the 1940s, North Michigan Avenue was known as the Magnificent Mile and supplanted State Street to become the new main street of this toddling town. This shift and all the resulting economic development could not have happened without the Michigan Avenue Bridge. This double-deck bridge is actually 2 side-by-side drawbridges divisible down the center. The parallel structures may operate individually. This allows one half of the bridge, for instance the northbound lanes, to be raised for maintenance and repair, while the other half can be used to carry traffic across the river. The Michigan Avenue Bridge was also the world's widest bascule bridge when built, with 2 upper deck roadways, 3 lanes each, and sidewalks to either side. The 2 lower deck roadways carry 2 lanes each. It's one of 4 double-deck bascules built in Chicago, but the only one designed to carry automobile traffic on both decks. Strolling past the Michigan Avenue bridge houses, it is hard not to notice the sculptural relief embellishments on the 4 towers at each corner of the bridge. The north bridge houses feature explorers Marquette and Joliet, and the town's early settlers, DeSable and Kinsey. Created by James Earl Fraser, they were donated by William Wrigley Jr. The south bridge houses feature the Fort Dearborn Massacre and rebuilding of the city after the Great Fire. Sculpted by Henry Herring, they were a gift of the B.F. Ferguson Fund.
At the start of the 20th century, if you've ever seen old photographs of the Chicago River, you'll see the main branch full of commercial steamboats, passenger cruise boats. The river literally chock full of watercraft. Over the decades, that the amount of traffic has decreased and changed. Even as comparatively recently as 30 years ago, you would have seen a significant amount of commercial traffic on the Chicago River main branch and south branch. These days, the traffic is predominantly recreational craft, typically sailboats traveling to and from the boatyards. However, you still do see commercial traffic on the Chicago River, barge traffic in particular.
By 1920, most of the commercial shipping coming to Chicago had shifted from the Chicago River to the Calumet. The city recognized the decline in use of the Chicago drawbridges and proposed a fixed bridge policy on the North Branch. But despite the river's less frequent use, the Chicago-style bascule design continued to improve and evolve.
So the Lakeshore Drive Bridge opened in 1937. It's the last one for a long time, and in a lot of ways sort of the culmination of the Chicago plan, because the city had run out of money. They had to use federal funding to build that as a Depression-era jobs project. And because Chicago was a big Democratic town, Franklin Roosevelt came and gave the opening speech in October of '37, used the opportunity actually to give a fairly important speech about quarantining the aggressor in Europe.
America hopes for peace. Therefore, America actively engages in the search for peace.
The bridge there was originally built with a lower level that was going to carry railroad trains across the river, because The mouth of the river was still a very important harbor area, had grain elevators, warehouses, railroad facilities on both sides, and they thought that a railroad link from the Northwestern's facilities on the north side to the Illinois Central's on the south side would be very useful. But the railroad tracks were never built, the lower level was never finished until it was rebuilt in the early 1980s for use by vehicles. And so today it's part of the double level street system out in the Lakeshore East and Illinois Center area. A few years ago, 2004, I guess, they actually found a guy living in the Lakeshore Drive Bridge. He had discovered a little area where there was no machinery that was big enough for him to kind of build a little cubbyhole in, and he had insulated it from the winter winds, and had even found a way to tap off of the electric lines that went to the motors there. And so the way I always hear the story is he had figured out a way to have a space heater, a television, and a Nintendo game system, but he couldn't run all three at once. It would trip a fuse and he'd get in trouble. And so eventually he did get it discovered in some way. And apparently he could even stay in as the bridge leaves were lifted. So I guess sort of like a recliner, that as the bridge leaves went up, he would just relax for a few minutes and not let anybody know that he was there. Because once the bridge tenders show up, that's not when you want to be sneaking out of your cubbyhole in the Lakeshore Drive Bridge.
Traffic on the Chicago bridges is a lot different than when the first movable bridge was built. But one thing that has remained the same is the bridge tenders still watch over every movement from their bridge houses. What used to be an intense, physically demanding job of turning and lifting bridges has been modernized into a few buttons and levers.
Okay, we're going up with one leaf at South Canal. South leaf is going up.
But while the bridge operation itself is simpler, the citywide operation is much more complex.
During the spring and fall bridge runs, it's CDOT that operates the opening and the closing of the bridges. We call them bridge lifts or boat runs, and they really are a pretty complex and organized symphony. It may not look like it, but there's a lot of thought put into them. First of all, we schedule the bridge lifts usually just 2 days a week. That's to minimize the impact on the downtown vehicular and pedestrian traffic. The actual operation of a bridge lift or a boat run involves teams of roving bridge tenders that basically leapfrog from one bridge to another. So if one team is the first bridge, the second team is assigned to the second bridge, then that first team will hopscotch them to get to the one ahead of them. That allows the bridges to lift sequentially and really minimizes the time that it takes to raise and lower a bridge. The entire process, starting on the south branch of the Chicago River, running to Lake Michigan, which is what we do in the springtime, that process can take anywhere from 2 to 3 hours. Sometimes it takes more than that if we have some operational issues with some bridges, but if we have a boat run that has just a few boats and everything that goes smoothly, then it can fall within that window. It's a great deal of coordination that goes into the bridge lifts because we want them to go as smoothly as possible and have as little impact as possible on vehicles and pedestrians.
We're here at Belmont Harbor, and behind us are some of the boats that come down the river every year and spend the summer in the harbor or on Lake Michigan. And we're with Grant Crowley of Crowley's Yacht Yard. And Grant is here to talk to us a little bit about his experiences with the river and the bridges and Chicago.
It's the only city in the world that you can be in a hermetically sealed, stuffy office in a high-rise, and 20 minutes later, be sailing out of Monroe Street Harbor in your little boat, completely relaxed. The river is the next renaissance for Chicago, and it is a great value.
What is the future of the movable bridges in the city of Chicago? Over the past several years, we've actually taken down some of the inoperable movable bridges and replace them with fixed span bridges. One of the ones that got the most attention was the North Avenue Bridge. But the bridges on the main and south branches of the Chicago River, as well as those on the Calumet River, again, those look and feel essentially the same way that they did when they were built 60, 70, 80 more years ago. And really the future of Chicago's movable bridges is, I guess, the present is the future. We anticipate that 20, 30, 40, even 50 years down the line, the main and south branches of the Chicago River are going to look essentially the same that they do now in terms of the bridges. The city operates the movable bridges in compliance with federal law, which states that the main and south branches are federally navigable waterways, and therefore the boating traffic technically has the right of way over all other modes of transport. That's why we lift the bridges in the first place, to allow the boats to pass. And we don't anticipate that law changing anytime soon. That's why we keep the bridges in a state of good repair. We have an aggressive program to rebuild and refurbish the bridges. Just over the last 10 or 15 years, we've completely rebuilt the Franklin Orleans Bridge, the Wabash Bridge. Other bridges have received significant makeovers, such as the Michigan Avenue Bridge and the LaSalle Street Bridge. We have a regular program to paint the bridges, which sounds like a simple undertaking, but really the painting of the bridges has to be done with consideration of the delicate balance of the trunnion bascule bridges. Whenever you repaint a bridge, you're adding several hundred pounds of paint to it. So every time we paint a bridge, we have to recalibrate the counterweights that allow the quick and efficient lifting of the bridges. We do that every time we do maintenance to a bridge or every time we paint a bridge. The balance is so delicate that even something as seemingly innocuous as painting it, it really can put the bridge out of whack. So we have a regular program for maintenance and upkeep. These bridges have operated in some cases close to 100 years in downtown Chicago. We anticipate them operating for another century or more.
As an example of the City of Chicago's commitment to the bridges, in 2013, the 90-year-old Well Street Bridge was completely rehabilitated. With approximately 78,000 commuters crossing this bridge every weekday, uninterrupted elevated train service was critical. Beginning in November 2012, the lower level of the bridge was closed to street traffic. And using barges and tarps to contain the dust, the approach structures of each leaf were sandblasted, reinforced, and a primer coat of paint applied. Yet the most amazing part of this undertaking was replacement of the truss superstructures over the river.
The contractor built a portion of the bridge on an off-site location, and then over the course of 2 weekends, we barged in the new truss, and then we staged it on the side of the bridge. And then with as short as possible 9-day closure, the crews working around the clock cut the old truss and reconnected the new truss, something the city has not done ever. So this was probably the most complex thing we've ever done in the city as far as a public works project.
Amazingly, each of these 500,000-pound truss superstructures were rotated into position by tug, then aligned, leveled, and slowly winched into place. Watching these huge structures get moved into place and so precisely aligned to match up the pattern and myriad of bolt holes for an exact fit was just mind-boggling. It is a testament to the impressive level of planning, coordination, and engineering savvy of everyone involved.
The bridges are historic, and so whenever we do reconstruction of a bridge, we don't upgrade the look of the bridge. We keep the same historic look. When we're done with it, you won't be able to see a difference because we're building it with exactly the same style of architecture as before. And to actually work on bridges like this, it's an awesome, awe-inspiring experience. We love these bridges. They're our pride and joy.
Hollywood has showcased Chicago and its bridges in countless films since the birth of cinema. From simple establishing shots to spectacular stunts, the bridges have played important roles.
Let's face it, it is the American city. This is, in my humble opinion, the most cinematic city in the country. I would say the bridges in Chicago are one major location that directors love.
It's difficult to think of a film shot in Chicago that doesn't make use of the bridges. One of the most iconic bridge jumps in films set in Chicago is in John Landis's The Blues Brothers from 1980. Dan Aykroyd jumps the East 95th Street Bridge over the Calumet River to demonstrate to John Belushi's character that the repurposed police car that he has adopted as a new blues-mobile is in fact worthy of the function. And when there is a pursuit, when there is a ticking time clock of some peril, it seems that the bridge will always be opening at that time, leading to bridge jumps that would otherwise not be necessary.
In 2010, Transformers shot several special effects scenes involving the bridges. CDOT was involved early in the process.
The special effects company reached out to us along with the production company, and they told us that they want to involve the city of Chicago, our bridges, in many stunts. And the main event stunt was at Michigan Avenue Bridge. And the type of stunt they wanted was the bridge leaves open. Some of the cars are stuck on the bridge. Some of them come crashing down, sliding down. There's this large sequence of events where one of the cars is teetering off the end of the bridge, and all these sorts of explosions and things like that. So the first thing we did was we met with the production company and the special effects company and their structural engineer to tell them how we want to connect these cars that would eventually slide or stay stationary as the bridge leaves open. And it took us a couple tries to get the equipment right, because we don't want any pieces of the equipment that they attach to our bridge to harm the bridge in any way. And that's because the bridges are historic, the bridges are very functional, and we don't want to compromise public safety in any way. But it took us 2 days worth of 14-hour days to accomplish that stunt of sliding the cars down the bridge.
I think that Chicago is and will remain a really important city for filmmaking. And the bridges, of course, will continue to play their own role in Chicago film.
It's been a fantastic journey to be able to learn the history of Chicago's bridges and then try to bring that to the world at large. Chicago has the world's greatest working bridge museum, and really now may be the best time ever to come and see this wonderful collection of drawbridges, unlike anywhere else on Earth. So with all these amazing bridges in Chicago, which one is my favorite? Hands down, it's gotta be Kinzie Street. That's where it all began, for me on my journey and for Chicago.
So if I have to choose my favorite of all the bridges, at least in downtown Chicago, I think it has to be the Amtrak Bridge, the one built in 1915 for the Pennsylvania Railroad. And I just love feeling the bank shake as it comes back down.
My favorite bridge is the Roosevelt Road Bridge. I grew up on the south side of Chicago, and I went to high school at St. Ignatius on Roosevelt Road. So every morning when I took the bus and I crossed that bridge, it was like I was crossing into a whole nother world.
My favorite bridge is the Lakeshore Drawbridge. I like it a lot because it has 4 towers. There's another dimension to it with the 2 levels.
That is probably the heaviest bridge in the city of Chicago. When you run the locks, it sounds like there's a beast in there. You could hear, "Arr."
bridge that has long been my favorite is the LaSalle Street Bridge, built in the late 1920s. Its architectural features, its huge and imposing trusses, how it is really at the start of the LaSalle Street corridor when you're on the north looking to the south.
My favorite bridge is the Michigan Avenue Bridge. Shooting this documentary, it's just amazing to me to see that it's actually two bridges, and when it rose, it just had this epic feel to it.
Of course, the great double-decker Michigan Avenue Bridge is an icon of the city and a mechanical marvel.
Personally, I love it because it reminds me of when I was a child. I used to meet my dad for lunch, and I'd have to cross the bridge to go meet him in his building. Once you cross the bridge, you see all the shops, and it just really brings together the feel of Chicago.
This documentary is available on DVD and includes additional full-length interviews, comments from the producers, and more. To order, visit chicagodrawbridges.com.
Okay, we will now take questions from our in-person audience. Pat, if you are willing to get up and chat with us, we'd love to talk a little bit more with you. Folks, if you do have a question, please walk up to the microphone here. We'll lift it up a little bit so that it's at a higher height. You won't have to necessarily touch it, but if you could please ask your question clearly, Pat will be able to answer it for us. So thank you.
I hope it will.
Yeah, that was fantastic. And your colleague,
Yes, Steve Hatch.
he went to St. Ignatius College Prep, my alma mater.
Oh, very good.
Awesome. I'll ask you later what year he graduated.
A lot of Chicago connections.
Yeah, a lot of Chicago connections.
I think we graduated about the same year, which is probably would have been about 1986.
Okay, nice,
Yeah.
very nice. All right, well, thank you. Does anyone have questions for Pat? I will sit down. You can listen to him, not me.
People on Zoom can ask questions too.
Oh, and if you are on Zoom, only Zoom, not Facebook, not YouTube, you can ask questions. You will need to unmute yourself, and then we will be able to hear you, and Pat will be able to answer your question.
Do you want to answer a question?
No.
Sure, go ahead. I thought somebody said they had a question.
I won't ask a question, but I want to.
Excuse me, if you could come up to the microphone, that'd be great. Thank you.
It's tricky to get here. Yeah, I like the way that the lettering graphics always work into the composition of everything you're working on, about 98% of the time. And,
Well, thanks.
not a question, it's just an observation.
Yeah,
There's
and-
a couple of them where the legibility kind of disappeared into some mechanical stuff, but otherwise, it was one to begin with. I think it's Michigan Avenue Bridge opening up like this, it comes right up.
Right. That was Matt Koza, who was our editor. And he did a great job of blending the music and the still images and the video and putting it all together. And honestly, I was sitting here watching it, and it's probably been maybe 7 or 8 years since I've watched it all the way through. And I'm still very pleased with how well it came out. Small touches like that Matt did, and then things that Steve did as far as directing and are piecing it all together as a story. Thank you. It was really fun to work with Matt, and he did a great job.
It's a little stuff that makes it.
Thank you.
Yeah. Anyway.
Thank you. And I'm biased on the topic, obviously. Yes.
Is that the Kinsey Street Bridge that's up?
Yes, right. Well, there's a road bridge, and then next to it is what used to be the Chicago and Northwestern Railway Bridge that stands up. And I perpetuate a bad joke that it's called the Viagra Bridge because it's always up.
I was going to make that joke,
but the reason it's up is that it has a very low clearance, similar to that Amtrak bridge that was mentioned in the movie, or Pennsylvania Railroad from 1915. That's the vertical lift bridge. That bridge there, just south of the Kinsey Street Bridge, that railroad bridge, only has a clearance of about 10 feet. And after 1911, the requirement was for 16.5 feet. Otherwise, then the bridges had to be maintained and open on demand. And so the railroad, not having any more customers east of the North Branch, now just leave it open. And also being a railroad and there's no profit in taking it down at this point, and they may need it at some point in the future.
So I seem to recall that decades ago being in that same position. Is that right?
Yes, and typically it would be left open because it was just a spur servicing whatever commercial customers were east of the North Branch on the north side of the river. And so the last commercial customer was closed in 2001, which was the Sun-Times building, where they had their production, and they would occasionally receive newsprint by railroad car, sometimes also by boat. And then that is now the site of Trump Tower. So. Yes.
Are there other cities that have double-decker bridges?
That's a good question. I know there are. There's quite a few fixed bridges that are double-decked, where they may have northbound and southbound or east and westbound traffic on 2 different levels. I've spent so much time on Chicago bridges. I don't have a great sense of where else. I think that may be more of a Google question than a Pat question. I'm sure there are, although Chicago did at the bridge at Lake Street was the very first double-deck, double-leaf bascule bridge in the world. And in fact, there was a lawsuit about that because the Scherzer Rolling Lift Bridge Company that was in Chicago had put one in their catalog, but never built one. And the catalog came out in 1908. And the city had to prove that it had some drawings or had invented that or had that concept prior, because Scherzer was trying to sue the city for patent infringement on that design. Sure.
I heard that the blueprints for these various bridges are, of course, extremely detailed.
Yes.
But also, they were designed to. And so I'm asking you if you know about this or not. These blueprints for these various bridges were designed so that even the most basic welder or iron workers would be able to assemble these bridges when they built them. I heard this from an engineer who once worked for CDOT some years ago. So
Yes.
So I'm wondering if you ever had a chance to look at the blueprints for these various bridges.
I have. In fact, CDOT was good enough to let me into their archives, which is up in basically kind of like the attic, although it's a skyscraper. It's not your traditional attic, but it's on the very top floor of, I want to say it's at 10 South LaSalle Street, 10 or 20 South LaSalle Street, where the CDOT has their offices up on the 10th floor, I believe. And then at the very top floor is their archives, and they have drawers and images and various things that I've been able to go through and look at for my book, which was very helpful, and some for the documentary. And the drawing details they have working drawings that go down to the very detail that then would be used on site. And in fact, one of the interesting stories relating to the drawings, when they rebuilt that Wells Street Bridge in 2013, I was there filming and it was cold. I was out there practically all day and batteries were dying. I'd go into Merchandise Mart and plug them in for, a half hour or so and hope to come back out and shoot some more things. And while I was there, I ran into the chief engineer at the time of Dan Burke, who nobody knows his name because that project went fine. If it hadn't, people might know who he is. But he was very nervous when they cut the first truss out. And so he's like, I got to get out of here for a little bit. So we took a little drive around the area to check the traffic reorientation and signage because he wanted to make sure that was right. And he was telling me that the contractor wanted to put their own designs into CAD and then build the bridge to match the old one. And he insisted that they use the original drawings from the 1920s when that was built in 1920 for their construction. And it was a big battle, but he won. And probably thankfully, because then the new truss matched up perfectly and it all came together. But had he not insisted on that, who knows how well that bridge would have fit together.
By CAD, you mean a computer-assisted drawing?
Right. So they wanted to put the whole thing digital, and he insisted they use the old drawings because they have all those stored up at CDOT for both existing bridges and old bridges that are no longer available.
There's a follow-up question. The old drawings, the old blueprints.
Yes.
Are they on this paper that's ready to cross hands, or is it some sort of some type of vellum or because obviously these blueprints have withstood 100 years of time almost.
Well, it depends on the era of the bridge. We have bridges that are over 100 years old and bridges that are, say, 30 to 50 years old, and anything in between. And so some of them are on like a plastic material. Others are on paper, but they're all really pretty well preserved and in good shape. There's a few that are getting pretty old, but they don't get a lot of use. Once they're there, they're on file, unless they're doing some repair or looking at something. So for the most part, they're in very good shape and they're preserved still at CDOT.
Thank you.
Sure. Yes.
Yeah, so they were talking about repainting the bridge. They could add hundreds of pounds.
Yeah.
Do they fine tune the counterweight, or do they just add a like amount to the counterweight? Balance it out.
Right. I know that they do some sandblasting, so that'll remove some paint. There's probably still some paint left that they paint over. So I think it's a little bit a combination of the whole exact process. I'm not sure what it does. I think part of it is they also are paying attention to the demand on the motor of how much amperage it's requiring to try to lift the bridge. So they basically just try to make sure that it's as close to the balance as possible. And I don't know if you noticed in some of the images, there's often like square blocks that could be added or removed. And the same thing down in the counterweights, down underneath the bridges and the approaches of the Chicago type bridges, where if you ever go to the Bridge House Museum on Michigan Avenue, that southwest tower, and you can enter at the Riverwalk level, when you go into the bridge room or the gear room, you can see to the left, there's another caged area, and it has easily a couple dozen of those huge iron blocks that then can be added or taken away from the bridge depending on what's done to it. Because that bridge originally actually had a rubber deck that has been since removed, and now it's a steel grid with pavement on top of it. So they've adjusted accordingly for those.
The Rush Street disaster.
Yes, in 1863.
Yes. Have they found a design that's completely impervious to the ignorant Irish?
I don't know. With the last name McBriarty, I can get away with that even in this day and age. And one correction, you made the right correction. When we did the film, I think I might have said very ignorant, and we changed it to ignorant because I wasn't sure. When I went back later and checked the article, they did say a very ignorant Irishman who was a substitute bridge tender. And that was kind of in that day and age, in 1863, the Irish were very much looked down upon because they were some of the more recent immigrants at that time, and Chicago was primarily German. In fact, even back later with the World's Exposition in 1893, there was guidebooks in German and English, and German folks from Germany were told, oh, you can come to the United States and function fine in Chicago on just German alone. You don't need to learn English. So just kind of a different how the racism has changed over time. Great. Any online questions from anybody?
Yeah, anybody on Zoom have questions?
Speak up.
You have to unmute yourself.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
Hi, this is Susan Kroll, and I'm a retired city planner. One of the projects I worked on years ago was the Montgomery Ward Catalog House right at Chicago Avenue.
Sure.
At that time, one of the things we were looking at doing was creating a bike path and pedestrian access across Chicago Avenue, but at the lower level, at the bridge level, under the bridge. And my question is, okay, so I've now retired, but has that happened? Is there access under Chicago Avenue to pedestrians and bicyclists?
At this time, there's not. They a couple years ago, I'm not sure exactly what year that was, whether it was 2019 or 2018 possibly, they removed the Chicago Avenue Bridge entirely, and then they put in its place a Bailey, I shouldn't say temporary, interim bridge was the word that they used. Temporary makes it sound flimsy, so the city doesn't like to use that word, but it's essentially a placeholder bridge for traffic currently, and then the hope is that there'll be enough funds available at some point where then they can build a more elaborate and a nicer fixed bridge across there. And last time I talked with the chief engineer, with Luis, he said that they were hoping, when that was going to be taken down, they were hoping to preserve the gears to be able to show those and have those featured as something you would see along that lower level pathway. But I really haven't checked into that for several years, so I'm not sure if there's been a change or what plans are in the works on that. So that's a good question. I only know a little bit of background on that right now. So I think it'll probably going to wait until they have sufficient funding for full replacement of that bridge, and it'll probably get tied, or it might possibly get tied to replacing both Division Street bridges with a fixed bridge, because there's currently another Bailey interim bridge on the east side, and then the old Bascule Bridge that's treated as a fixed bridge on the west side going across Goose Island.
Okay, right. Thank you very much. I remember seeing the gears and thinking that was an awesome thing to be able to see, and to think that, if you were just a pedestrian being able to see it, that would be wonderful. So thank you. I hope we can do that.
Yes, that's one of the cool things in spending time like this. They were doing some work at one point on the Halstead Bridge up on North Halstead Street, and there was one of the bridge houses was wide open, and there were no workmen around, and so I just figured, well, I'll ask for forgiveness later, and walked inside, took a look in at the bridge house on the upper floor, so took a few pictures, and then worked my way down to the basement and got in by the gears there and took there as well. And it was, it's really super cool to see down inside the gears and the mechanism for opening and closing these bridges, which they're duplicated, one on each side, whether there's a bridge house there or not, so that it's got a redundancy to it. And you can, as I said, go into the Bridge House Museum on that southwest tower of Michigan Avenue and get in and see the gears, even during a lift. So it's pretty cool to see that function. And all of a sudden daylight comes streaming in as the bridge opens up near its top end, and you can see the other bridge house across the street.
Thank you. And Patrick, it was a great program, great movie.
Well, thanks so much. I would love to try to get this shown at some point again on public television or some other thing. And at one time we were talking about trying to get the CDOT to maybe do some kind of a public showing on one of the bridges, and that just never came about, but it'd be fun to do something like that again.
Patrick, do you have time for one more question?
Yes, please, I can hear you. Go ahead.
Okay, this is Jerry Bloom Stevenson calling from Florida, but I wanted to ask about the wooden platform bridge that I saw early in the documentary, and it looked like it had streetcar tracks on it, and it didn't look wide enough for cars. Can you tell me about that bridge?
Are you referring to the, let's see, the bridge that was at the very first drawbridge, you mean, that was wooden that came up and closed?
So, no, it was a current bridge. At least it sounded like it was a still active bridge today. Is there such one, or was just an old picture that was showing? It wasn't part of the original bridges.
I was trying to figure which one. There were some drawings that I did do of an early bridge based on plans for the city of Chicago. And then there were also historic images. And so, you know, most of these bridges, the swing type bridges, or even the early pontoon float bridges that would rotate, of course, there weren't automobiles at that time. This is, you know, before early 1900. This would have been throughout the 1800s. Those would have been really set up for wagon, buggy, horse and carriage, and pedestrian crossing. And in fact, some of the bridges would be open for northbound traffic and then southbound traffic. And so they would switch and have one or the other going through. So they were fairly narrow at that time with some of these very early bridges, especially the wooden bridges or wood and iron bridges. I hope maybe that answers your question without knowing exactly which image you're talking about.
Well, I also recall when I was a kid, there was a bridge that had a traffic light at it. And it was the same thing. You could go one direction on one light and then the other direction back. And it was on the north side somewhere, but I don't know where.
Yeah, I'm not familiar. You know, there was at Fullerton Avenue, there was an old swing bridge that was there up until the 1960s. And then that in, I believe, 1961 or so was actually replaced with then a fixed bridge. And that could be what you're referring to, possibly.
No, I think it was on the North Loop side.
Okay, yeah. I'm not sure offhand, but yeah, there's fascinating. There's so much, even I, after spending 8 years putting out of the book, Chicago River Bridges, and then this documentary on top of it, there's still new bridge history that I don't know yet. So there's always more to learn.
I see a raised hand from Jerry Bloom Stevenson.
That was me.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Was able to unmute myself.
Anybody else?
Any other questions?
Well, great. I thanks so much for everybody tuning in remotely and everybody that's here in person. It was really fun. Like I said, it's been several years since I've seen this. It was really fun to watch. I'm glad it seems to stand up to the test of time, and hope you enjoyed it. And we'll maybe from now on not look at a bridge the same way either. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
And I do have some books for sale and DVDs if you'd like to take one of those home or take a look at them while I'm still here. Great.
Thank you, Pat.
Sure.